Hello and welcome to Lexiconned. I'm TJ, your guide to the fascinating tales behind the words we use and the drinks we sip. Now today we're tackling whiskey, the storied spirit that's brought warmth, wit, and maybe a touch of chaos to humanity for centuries. From ancient distilleries to modern bars, whiskey's history is as nuanced as its taste. Let's start with whiskey's origins, a tale steeped in myth, ingenuity, and a fair bit of competition. Ireland and Scotland both claim to be the birthplace of whiskey, and honestly, the debate is about as fiery as a cask-strength pour. But here's what we know. In Ireland, the story begins with monks. These traveling holy men, as early as the 6th century, picked up the art of distillation during their journeys to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Back then, distillation was used to create perfumes and medicines. Now leave it to the Irish to look at a medicinal alcohol and think, what if we drank this instead? By the 11th century, they'd adapted the process to grain, creating uisce, which in Gaelic means water of life. Now, early whiskey wasn't aged and was rough around the edges. Think moonshine with medieval vibes. Meanwhile, in Scotland, distillation appeared slightly later. The first written record of whiskey in Scotland dates to 1496, when King James IV ordered malt to make aqua vitae, Latin for water of life. Now the Scots were quick to embrace whiskey making, and they started aging their spirits in oak barrels, which gave it smoother, richer flavors that we now associate with Scotch whiskey. The key difference? The Irish triple distill their whiskey, making it lighter and smoother, while the Scots typically distill twice, creating a bolder, often smokier profile, especially when peat is involved. So, who invented whiskey? Well, both nations developed their own versions around the same time. And the truth is, distillation itself was an idea borrowed from ancient civilizations. But try telling that to an Irishman or a Scotsman, and you'll probably need a drink afterwards. Now let's move our history of whiskey across the Atlantic to America, 1791, when whiskey became more than just a drink in America, it became political. Enter the Whiskey Rebellion. So to help pay off war debts, Alexander Hamilton proposed a tax on distilled spirits and the stills that created them. Frontier farmers, many of whom distilled whiskey as a way to preserve surplus grain, weren't really thrilled. For them, this tax was more than an inconvenience, it was an attack on their livelihoods. And by 1794, tensions boiled over in western Pennsylvania. Farmers took up arms, burned tax collectors' homes, and even tarred and feathered government agents. The rebellion grew so large that President George Washington himself led 13,000 troops to quell it. Imagine that. The first and only time a sitting president has led troops in the field was over whiskey. Now, the rebellion ultimately fizzled out, but it highlighted the growing divide between urban and rural America, a divide that, let's be honest, still exists. But as a sign of things to come, the whiskey tax was ultimately repealed by President Thomas Jefferson in 1802. Now, fun fact, whiskey became so revered in America that it became the first product protected by federal law. In 1897, Congress passed the Bottled in Bond Act, which ensured whiskey met strict standards for quality and purity. Why, you may ask? Well, back then, some distillers were cutting their whiskey with things you probably wouldn't want to drink. Tobacco juice, prune juice, turpentine, things that really don't pair well with ice. The act not only protected consumers, but also restored trust in the industry. In the early 20th century, whiskey in America faced another crisis: Prohibition. From 1920 to 1933, the U.S. government banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. But Americans didn't stop drinking. They just got creative. Bootleggers, speakeasies, and rum runners kept the booze flowing while some distilleries survived by selling medicinal whiskey. Yes, you could get a prescription for whiskey. Got a cold? Take a shot. Feeling blue? Take another shot. Let's just say doctors were very generous with their prescriptions. Meanwhile, organized crime syndicates thrived, and law enforcement struggled to keep up. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, the whiskey industry had been gutted. But whiskey's story didn't end there. It rebounded in the mid-20th century, and today enjoys a renaissance, with craft distillers and global brands alike flourishing. Now, speaking of whiskey styles, let's clarify something that trips up a lot of people: the difference between whiskey and bourbon. Whiskey is the umbrella term for spirits distilled from grains like barley, corn, rye, or wheat. Bourbon, on the other hand, is a uniquely American creation with strict rules that were codified by law in 1964. For one, bourbon has to be made in the United States. It also must be at least 51% corn, aged in new charred oak barrels, and free of any additives or flavorings. That high corn content gives bourbon its signature sweetness, while the charred barrels add caramel and vanilla notes. And yes, Kentucky is bourbon's heartland, and the Bourbon Trail is a terrific cultural experience into the history and the production of bourbon, but legally, it can be made anywhere in the United States. Now, whiskey's influence goes beyond the glass. It's deeply embedded in our culture. Think about it. Whiskey's the stuff of songs, movies, and literature. From cowboys sipping bourbon around a campfire in old westerns to the glamorous whiskey cocktails in a James Bond film. It's more than a drink. It's an icon. Writers like Mark Twain and Ernest Hemingway were known whiskey enthusiasts, weaving its allure into their works. And let's not forget whiskey's place in music. Country, rock, and blues all have their odes to this spirit. Just listen to George Jones' White Lightnin' or Leonard Skinner's Whiskey Rock and Roller. Whiskey has also become a symbol of camaraderie and celebration, whether it's a dram shared to toast a milestone or a bottle opened to mend fences. Whiskey brings people together. And don't worry, there's no wrong way to drink whiskey. Whether you order it neat, on the rocks, or in a cocktail, it's not just about the drink. It's about the moments and stories that come with it. So where does the word whiskey come from? Well, as we mentioned earlier, it's rooted in its Gaelic, uisce beatha, or water of life. And over time, uisce became uisce, which morphed into whiskey. The spelling difference. Whiskey with an E is for Irish and American varieties, and whiskey without the E is for Scotch. That only became standardized in the 19th century, with the exception of Maker's Mark, who still spells whiskey without an E as a nod to their Scottish heritage. So if you're ever stuck in a spelling debate, now you've got the historical ammo. Whiskey's story is one of survival, innovation, and passion. From its Gaelic roots to its battles with taxes, prohibition, and rivalries, it's more than a drink. It's a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. So the next time you sip on a glass of whiskey or bourbon, remember, you're tasting history. That's all for today's episode of Lexiconned. Thanks for joining me on this spirited journey. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with your friends, leave a review, and don't forget to subscribe. Sláinte. As always, Lexiconned is written, recorded, and produced by me, your logophile companion, TJ Martin. Sources and additional credits are in the show notes.